advantage that many others lack, which is that it acknowledges the sociality of knowledge and various epistemic practices in a way that other views of epistemic blames don't. So I think that that's why it's worth thinking about it and pushing it a bit further in that direction. So the plan then is something like this. First, I'm going to introduce the relationship picture to you as I understand it. The mastermind is here, so he can correct me anytime he likes. And then I'm going to say, to show you what I find problematic with this picture, and then I'm going to make two friendly suggestions. So the epistemic relationship account, epistemic blame relationship account is an account according to which blame is a matter of a relationship modification. And it involves two elements. So first, I judge that you're epistemically blameworthy. So when I blame you for something, and that means that I judge that you have impaired our epistemic relationship, according to Cameron's picture. And by epistemic relationship, I quote, he means something that's constituted by certain intentions, expectations, and attitudes people have concerning how to act and feel towards one another. Intentions, expectations, and attitudes that are justified by a wide range of facts about parties to the relationship, depending on those involved and the kind of relationship it is. And by an impaired relationship, he means this. Again, this is a quote from his hopefully forthcoming book. Someone with whom you stand in some relationship, so this is what you're judging when you judge the relationship is impaired, has intentions, expectations, or attitudes that in some way fall short of the normative ideal of that relationship. So that's the first part of epistemic blame. And the second part is that so I judge that you're blameworthy. The second part is that I modify my relationship with you. And here, all we mean is that I adjust my intentions and expectations in accordance with my judgment that you're blameworthy, that you've impaired our relationship. And this is the important part. Sorry, this is at least not both equally important parts of the account, but this is the one that makes a blame response distinct from a mere judgment of blameworthiness, and it also makes it more theoretically significant. So here's the picture then again. There's judgment of blameworthiness, and then there's a blame response. Excuse me. Now, we're all supposed to be standing in this general epistemic relationship with each other, and this is an important element of the account, so that's why I'm introducing it to you. And that's defined by normative expectation. And again, a quote from the book, to have this kind of expectation is to make a certain kind of demand from you that you will meet certain epistemic criteria in the running of your intellectual life. And by epistemic criteria, Cameron deliberately leaves open what he means, but it's the usual suspects, right? Standards of justification, rationality, reliability, and so on. And the final element of the account that I want to introduce to you is that the attitudes constitutive of this general epistemic relation are things like this. So A intends, so more symbols, we were talking in the break about symbols. A intends for any intellectual act X of A's to meet epistemic criteria Y, unless A has good reason not to. Okay, so if Caitlin and I, sorry to keep using you as a guinea pig, are in an epistemic relationship, which we are all the time, in this general epistemic relationship, then I intend for any intellectual act of mine that I meet epistemic criteria, justification, reliability, and so on, unless I have some good reason not to do so. And I also expect Caitlin to meet such criteria for any intellectual act of hers. And because we're in a relationship, she intends all of these good things as well, and she expects these things in return from me. So you'll be pleased to hear that you probably, hopefully can see that Cameron's still nodding his head, so awesome, okay, so I'm still on the right track. Here's a simple example of epistemic blame. At the time T1, Jim expects that Dwight, his colleague, will meet epistemic criteria when forming beliefs about their colleagues. So this is at 12:05. That's not in the book. I added it creatively. Now at 12:10, Dwight shares with Jim a conspiracy belief about their colleagues formed against the evidence. So something silly like how their boss tried to cheat him out of his job. They always get precedence and so on. At 10:1, Jim is a slow guy, so he judges that his relationship has been impaired and modifies the expectation he had at 12:05, no longer expecting Dwight to meet these criteria when forming beliefs about their colleagues. Now, that's a simple example. So there's the judgment that the relationship has been impaired, and then there's the blame response. Now, as you might imagine, those of you who know Cameron's work, things get a little bit more complex. So here's a more complex example of how this works. And this example is borrowed from the talented Mr. Ripley, the one that Miranda Fricker discusses. So here is Marge, who has very good evidence that Tom killed her fiancé, Dickie. She shares it with Dickie's father, who famously says, Marge, I wish I had a nice thick Southern American accent, but Marge, there's female intuition, and then there are facts. So then how do we interpret this example in terms of the blame, the epistemic blame account that Cameron offers? Here is again a quote from Cameron: "As a victim of testimonial injustice, it seems fitting that Marge may judge that her relations with Herbert have been impaired." Sorry, Herbert is the father of Dickie, in significant ways. It also seems fitting that she may make certain modifications to her own attitudes and intentions vis-a-vis that relationship accordingly. So there's the judgment of blameworthiness, and there's the blame response. And what makes this judgment fitting is that Herbert falls short of the normative ideal of the GER by failing to have the appropriate epistemic expectations of Marge. So that's the thing that makes the blame response and the judgment fitting. Herbert has a standing prejudicial belief that women are irrational, which seems like another way of saying that he does not expect that. And here we plug in one of those constitutive expectations and intellectual acts of B's that B will meet epistemic criteria Y. So that's the more complex example of how the relationship picture works. And I'm introducing it because it's going to be important in generating a problem, I think, even though Cameron thinks it's a bit of a poster child for the accounts, that other accounts can't really handle that kind of case. So am I making this too personal? Should I say both? Both for MS, okay. Okay, so here's the problem, I think. And I think that there are cases of blame where there's no relationship and no relevant relationship. And in fact, the Mr. Greenleaf and Marge example is just a case like this. So intuitively, I think what's going on here is that the epistemic injustice towards Marge partly consists in Herbert Greenleaf's not seeing her and treating her as an epistemic agent in the first place. And one way of articulating this is in terms of objectification, which several people have done, starting with Fricker. Another way of doing it is something that I've called explanatory injustice, so where you're interpreting someone's beliefs by appeal to reasons why instead of motivating reasons, but forgetting about these technical ways of spelling it out. I think very basically, as far as Greenleaf is concerned, Marge just isn't someone worthy of equitable epistemic exchanges or anyone worthy of a relationship. So in other words, I think that they don't have an epistemic relationship at all. And this, not only don't they have an epistemic relationship, but this in itself seems a good ground to blame Herbert Greenleaf epistemically, precisely for not having this kind of relationship. So then the kind of case I want to look at, to generalize from this, has two features. So there's no epistemic relationship involved between the two agents. So there's no epistemic relationship involved. And this lack of a relationship is in itself a good reason for epistemic blame. And the first kind of case, I think there are many various forms of epistemic injustice involve this. The first one is epistemic exploitation, where, for those of you who are not familiar with Nora Berenstein's, sorry, some of you are very familiar with it, but anyway, so this is the idea when an oppressor or a dominant person demands from the oppressed that they explain or justify the nature of their oppression. And moreover, not only there's a demand to do so, but the response is inevitably met with skepticism on the part of the oppressed. So suppose that I touched a Black colleague's hair in supposed admiration, and she turned around and said, "Veli, this is like 101 racist textbook kind of stuff, microaggression, or not even micro anymore." And instead of shutting up and learning something from this, I go, "No, what do you mean? Like I really like your hair," and try to suggest that she doesn't really know what she's talking about. I really meant well. Why is she thinking of this as a racist act? So that's one kind of example. And moreover, even in the way I'm talking about it already, I'm preemptively skeptical about any explanation that she will give or justification, depending on what I'm asking. So in that kind of case, I think that there's no epistemic relationship, because I'm not actually treating the other person as an epistemic equal. And another kind of case is willful hermeneutical ignorance. So white ignorance, straight ignorance, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's when the dominant knower ignores the epistemic resources of the marginalized. And again, we're talking about conceptual resources. We're talking about, in general, basically, the dominant person is not treating the other as an epistemic equal. And I think it's another good case where there's no epistemic relationship. And that's a good reason for epistemic blame. So to generalize, I think in any case where you treat the other person as an epistemic non-agent, there is no epistemic relationship in the right kind of way. So putting this together into a a proper argument, I think. Well, you were the judge of that. But anyway, it has the shape of an argument. So there are cases where there's no epistemic relationship, and that's an essential feature of the power dynamic. Sorry, something's in my way, I can't read properly. And this lack of relationship is partly what's blameworthy about such cases. Third, if blameworthiness is possible in the absence of a relationship, blameworthiness can't constitutively involve a relationship. So there's something amiss with the relationship account of blame. Now, here's a possible response. This is Cameron in his more controversial mood. So he could come back and say, look, there's always a relationship between epistemic agents. And in fact, he considers something like this. So it's only in a footnote, but he says, okay, what about cases in which there's no relationship between the two agents? And here's what he says, reminding us that his account is based on Scanlon's story. He says, each of us seems to stand in a kind of relationship with every other rational human being, simply qua fellow rational beings. As beings capable of showing concern for the justifiability of our actions and attitudes, we deserve a certain kind of regard and respect. We can say that perpetrators of testimonial injustice in cases that don't involve personal relationships nevertheless count as blameworthy on this account because their ways of impairing this more general moral relationship. So I think that this is fine as it goes, but I don't think it's quite going to save the account. Firstly, that's a moral sense of blame that isn't at issue here, right? So we're not discussing moral sense of blame. And moreover, according to Cameron's own description of at least the case the Marge case, the Marge and Herbert case, there is no epistemic relationship involved. So remember that he says Herbert has a standing prejudicial belief that women are irrational, which seems like another way of saying that he does not expect that for an intellectual act X of B's that B will meet epistemic criteria Y. And again, he says paradigm perpetrators of testimonial injustice really do lack the relevant normative expectations, just as it appears. So given that these kinds of expectations are constitutive of the epistemic relationship, this is, I think, a good case for saying that there is no relationship involved. Okay, again, there is no relationship. So just a quick look at the time. Okay, good. So a couple of friendly suggestions, I think. I mean, what exactly has gone wrong here? So, this was supposed to be a showcasing of the picture, precisely this kind of case, and yet there's no relationship. So, and yet a relationship is supposed to be constitutive of blame. What's amiss? And I think that I put as a conjecture. I think that the account makes blame too personal and too descriptive, and I've kind of lumped them all together. But I think that these are two very different considerations. But I haven't quite worked out at which point the descriptiveness is the problem, and at which point the personal issue is the point. But hopefully that will you can help me during the discussion. So just to remind you of the picture, epistemic blame on the picture is relationship modification. So I judge you that you're epistemically blameworthy, that you've impaired our relationship, and then I modify my relationship with you. That is, I adjust my intentions and expectations. Now, I think that this second part of the account is actually compatible with there not being a positive actual relationship between the two actors. So I can modify so presumably when you, if you're silly enough to get married, then you didn't have a relationship with your spouse's mother, and then you enter into this new relationship. I think we can talk about a modification of a relationship in that kind of case. So I think that the real culprit is the thinking of judgments of blameworthiness in terms of this sort of impaired epistemic relationship. And to remind you, the relationship is actually constituted by actual intentions and normative expectations. And I think this is what's stirring trouble for the account. And likewise, the impairment is also construed in terms of an actual relationship that has to be there. So if that's the problem, if the actual expectations, the actual attitudes are the culprits, these are the things that are absent in epistemic injustice cases, and hence blocking the account from doing the work that it wants to do, then the most natural suggestion would be, well, dump the idea of actual attitudes and talk about norms between concerning these attitudes. So, and I should say that it's going to be a reminder to some of you that according to Cameron, the content of the attitudes is already normative. So the expectations that we have of each other are already normative, right? So remember, I expect Caitlin that she will meet epistemic criteria. That's a normative expectation. It's not a descriptive thing. So that's where normativity comes in. What I'm also suggesting is that it should go into also the kinds of, the thing that individuates the relationship. So then with that idea in mind, I propose a general epistemic relationship star, which is constituted not by attitudes, but norms for attitudes, such as A ought to expect for an intellectual act of X, X of B's, that B will meet epistemic criteria, Y. So I don't have to expect this of Caitlin, but I ought to expect, what defines our relationship is that I ought to expect that of her. And likewise, I ought to intend that I observe these, meet these criteria and so on. So then the general epistemic relationship is no longer a matter of the actual attitudes of people, but of norms for these attitudes. And then, of course, all epistemic agents stand in this kind of relationship, just as Cameron wanted it to be. And there won't be any failures, any breakages. And then we read impairment not in terms of someone with whom you stand in a particular kind of relationship, has intentions and so on, that don't meet the standards for that relationship, but we interpret it as someone with whom you stand in this general epistemic relationship has intentions, expectations that fall short of that general epistemic, the new account of general epistemic relationship. So, so again, this is no longer a matter of personal relationships, but of the general of norms amongst attitudes, rather than actual people's attitudes towards each other. So just to kind of compare the two pictures a little bit more visually, if that helps. So the original picture is, I think, and you'll be horrified to hear that Cameron stopped nodding his head. So I fear I'm in trouble. So there's a judgment. So I judge you've impaired our relationship or the GER. So it's not clear to me, at least from the book, which one the judgment really concerns. So in other words, you haven't lived up to standards of this relationship or standards for this GER. So there's the gold standard up there. The GER is individuated in terms of actual attitudes, so actual expectations and intentions of believers. And blame is a modification of the actual epistemic relationship. And what makes blame appropriate is the standards for GER or for this relationship. So that gold standard over there. So, and that connects connects everyone. So according to my proposal, you have a judgment that you've impaired the GER understood in terms of norms now, so you haven't lived up to that standard. And GER is individuated by norms of attitudes for attitudes of believers rather than the attitudes themselves. And blame is a modification of our existing epistemic relationship, so that's the only thing that stays the same. So it stays the same. And what makes blame fitting is the GER star. And the reason it makes it fitting is because I've built the gold standard into the GER. Okay, so you might think, okay, storm in a teacup, perhaps, Cameron always meant the picture that way. So, and this is what I was toying with last night over beer. So, so perhaps the GER, his GER was always meant as a normative ideal, and judgments of blameworthiness were always judgments that the actual epistemic relationship hasn't lived up to this general epistemic relationship. I mean, I very much doubted because there are many places in which things are formulated in terms of standards for that particular relationship that Caitlin and I have, and also the possible response that I earlier cited based on Scanlon for cases when there is no actual relationship. So if this was always meant like this, then that response would have been unnecessary because there would always be this general epistemic relationship as a normative ideal connecting us all. But anyway, if that's the case, then I would suggest this. First of all, frame the GER as I have. So it's a doubly normative thing. So in terms of norms for attitudes that people should have with each other, and then the normative content of those attitudes that you already have. And then drop all talk of personal relationships other than the actual epistemic relationship that obtains between agents, which is, I think, the only thing of relevance, actually, because whether you and I are lovers or not makes no difference to whether I should be epistemically judged, blamed or not. And then allow that this actual epistemic relationship may not exist. So we may be, as in the cases of Greenleaf and Marge, there's no epistemic relationship. And finally, frame both the impairments and the blameworthiness in terms of falling short of this doubly normative GER standard. So with 3 minutes to go, I'm doing well. So the proposal then is that epistemic blame is a judgment that you're epistemically blameworthy, just as on the original picture, except that means on the proposal that I judge that you've impaired this normative GER. And I modify my actual epistemic relationship with you, just as on the original picture, but obviously now the accordingly is according to my judgment that you failed short of the GER star. And I think that this allows us to have our cake and eat it, basically. So first, it's going to keep all the good aspects of the original account, I think. So, well, what I consider to be the good aspects anyway. So first, that we stand in a general epistemic relationship to each other that has a normative force for all of us. Secondly, that there is a difference between blame and judgments of blameworthiness. I'm not sure I buy that point, but anyway, that's certainly something that's big on the account. So, and this, on the current proposal, we can keep that difference. And finally, the idea that the significance of blame comes from the modification of individual relationships, in this case, the epistemic relationship. So I think it allows us pretty much to keep all of these good things, and moreover, it accommodates blame in cases where there's no relationship. So I think it does allow us to do a bit more work than the original. Thank you very much.